Hello, everyone, and yeah, welcome back to the Ironsworn Guyz. We've kind of been that is us, that is us. We've been off for a while because we've been both very busy, um, doing various things, but we're back to talk about some stuff. And what are we going to talk about this month, Steve?
Uh, no, we're we're here to introduce new players to role-playing games.
And specifically, like how we would do that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And approaches to getting new people into role playing games. We've talked a
yes.
little bit about getting like tips for new players for solo games, which is a
Hmm.
different kettle of fish entirely. But this has been inspired by something that's happened to me recently. I've been playing as I've been talking to every single person in the street, people in my job, just anyone that will care to listen. Even if they don't care to listen, I'll grab them and tell them about it anyway. But I've been running a campaign in the between and been having a great time of it. But one of the curious things about this campaign is that one of my players, my friend Louise, has joined this campaign, and the between is I would say quite a challenging game for role players in terms of what it asks you to do and the subject matter it asks you to handle. She's never played a role playing game before. And not only that, she had never really played a board game before. And I only know her because she answered an advert that we'd put out on Reddit for the online Blood on the Clock, the in person Blood on the Clock Tower group that I run. And she was like, "Oh, I fancy trying it. I've seen games of it online. I want to come along." She came along. We're firm friends, and here we are. But I kept thinking, that's such a huge leap
Mm.
because conceptually role playing games can be quite odd to new people, I think, and I always
Yeah.
struggle to whenever I'm talking to someone about the channel or whatever. And I had this last week. I was at a party last week, and someone was like, "Oh, what are you doing these days?" And I was like, they were kind of asking, what creative projects have you got going on? Because when I knew them, I was doing kind of film stuff and theatre and things like that. And I was like, well, have you heard of Dungeons and Dragons? And that's the only way I could kind of describe it to them because they're normal
Yeah.
people, right? Um, and having to figure that out. So introducing a new player to role playing games, there's so many obstacles like up front, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges because like you said, there are sometimes just expressing what the concept of a role-playing game is like, it's pretend, but
Mm.
there's structure to it,
It's
and
kind of a game,
it's kind of a game,
kind
but
of
also we don't
improv.
really care about rules.
Yeah.
And yeah, uh, and then I think very naturally there's also, once you have explained what a game is to somebody, there can be a sense of awkwardness or embarrassment when you leave the game part of it. I feel like this is something that is maybe unique to role playing games,
Mm.
in that if you sit down to play a board game with someone and you explain the rules to them, now they may go, well, this is just not my kind of hobby,
Mm.
but they'll probably get the rules enough that you can sit down and play a game with them.
Mm-hmm.
But when you sit down to play a role playing game, you're like, all right, here are all these rules that we have to follow,
Mm-hmm.
but also do whatever you want. We're creating a story together around this table, so you have to engage your imagination and pretend to be a different person and say, talk like they would talk, or
Mm.
come up with what they would say, come up with what they would do, come up with the internal struggles that they would have. And for a lot of people, I think that is a sticking point where there's just this moment of like awkwardness of, wait, I'm not allowed to do this.
Mm.
Like I'm not, I don't do that stuff. Like I could follow rules for a
Mm-hmm.
game,
Yeah.
but I'm not an actor. I'm not, you know, a writer. I'm not whatever creative role you want to attach to it.
Mm.
And so I think it is an interesting challenge for introducing somebody to a role playing game, because you have that struggle to overcome. And I think that I don't know. I think everybody has in them the ability to play a role and to play pretend.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just a matter of trying to find ways to unlock that desire in someone to really get them locked in with a role-playing game.
And there's an interesting thing that I kind of thought of, where there's a wonderful board game channel and website called Shut Up and Sit Down. Have it in the UK, and it's very famous. And they did a great video where it was like the art of teaching people how to play board games, right? And they broke it down in a really succinct way. And they said that when you teach someone a new board game, you really want to just tell them three things. First of all, you want to say who we are, what we're doing, and how you win. Those are the three things, right, that you tell people when you play a board game. You think of a game like Azul or something. We are Portuguese tile makers. We are making a mosaic that makes pretty patterns, and you win by making these combinations of colors and get the most points. That's a really simple way of breaking that down. You can apply that to everything. Apply that to a role-playing game. So who are we? Well, that's up to you. You could be anyone you want. What are we doing? Well, there is a structure, but you can do whatever you want. And how do you win? Oh, you can't win. There's no winning. There's nothing. So, like,
you have fun.
That's exactly. So people already, even if they're familiar with board games and familiar with these concepts, they are immediately thrust into a world of uncertainty. And I would say that my friend Louise, and she won't mind saying this, the times that she struggled the most with playing a role-playing game is when she's like, what do I do? And I'm like, you can do anything you want. And she's like, don't tell me that, because now I've got this kind of paralysis, and it's something that like she's got round after a while, and she's kind of fought through it, and it now becomes a little more natural to her. But it was really fascinating watching someone completely new to this try and figure out, but also, and we will kind of get to talk about this. This is someone who'd never played a role playing game before, which means that they'd never played D&D before. Yeah. And, again, not picking on D&D, but they'd never played a game where, that's the most relatable thing that anyone can say if you're trying to explain a role-playing game to them, that they vaguely might know that you are tooling up and fighting monsters and, exploring dungeons and finding treasure. Like, there was none of that prejudice there. And there was none of perhaps even someone who might know a little more about more kind of traditional like OSR games. Like they might not know about like spell slots or having damage modifiers and armor classes and stuff, which are all things that if you're vaguely curious about role-playing games, you might know. And you have this rare opportunity to basically say, well, hang on, if this is your first role-playing game, then to you this is what role-playing games are. Right, that's just what it is, because that's your only experience with it. So unfortunately, my friend Louise has played perhaps one of the most unusual, challenging role-playing games ever, that it's very unique, and she's not going to find anything else particularly like that unless she plays other Carved from Brindlewood games. But it raised the interesting question to me of like, if someone came to me again and said, I'm thinking about getting into role-playing games, what path I'd kind of recommend they go down, or like if they wanted to join like my group, what I'd play with them. And how do you feel? Are you down for throwing people in the deep end, or do you think there is a better way to do things?
I mean, I'm always down for throwing people into the deep end. I think that oftentimes the best way to learn something is a little bit of that sink or swim mentality, especially when it is something like a role-playing game where, I mean, let's be honest, like there are no real like consequences to if you don't play the game right. Right? Like it's not like, you're throwing somebody into the deep end and they're an EMT and it's like, well, I hope you can save this person's life. Good luck. It's just like, okay, we're playing a game here. So
yeah, throwing someone in the deep end is not good if you're a surgeon.
Yeah, exactly.
The stakes are low, right?
The stakes are low here.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are things that we can do when introducing somebody to a game that can maybe help to lay that foundation for them
Hmm.
so that it is more likely that they're going to swim than sink. And kind of thinking about that specifically, one of the things that I like to think about when trying to introduce somebody new is trying to find a particular property or a genre that they're interested in
Mm.
and focusing on that as a way to bring them into the hobby. Because, you know, yeah, maybe D&D is the default game that we use to introduce people, but that doesn't have to be.
Hmm.
And if you have somebody who's interested in trying a role-playing game, but they don't really like fantasy, or they're not really into killing monsters, there are plenty of other games out there that you can get into with it.
Mm.
And my first experience with a role-playing game, now I didn't have somebody who was like actively trying to get me into role-playing games. I kind of stumbled into it by accident,
Hmm.
but it happened, and I think I've told this story before. It happened because I was sitting in my dorm at my freshman year of college, and there was another guy in the common room that I was sitting in reading a Lord of the Rings book that I had never seen before. And as a Lord of the Rings fanatic, I was like, I don't know that book. What is that book? And he proceeded to explain to me what role playing was, and I was like, okay, when are we rolling up characters? Let's go.
Mm.
And that was my way in. And we only played that campaign for a couple of months before we switched to D&D. We played a Star Wars RPG, we played Vampire the Masquerade. Like, we played a whole bunch of different things.
Hmm.
But the path in for me in that very instance was, that's a topic, that's a world that I'm interested in. Tell me more about this thing that I don't like. I see the book and I don't recognize that book, and I pride myself on knowing what all of the books about Lord of the Rings are.
Hmm.
So give me this information. And that was my way in. So
Yeah.
if somebody's interested in Star Wars, there are Star Wars RPGs out there. If
Mm.
someone is interested in, dark Victorian England, hunting monsters and deep and intense role play, I mean, there's the between, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
I think like, you're right though, because IP is huge, right?
yeah,
It's if you can find an IP in it that someone's interested in, that's half of the battle, because they might be completely unfamiliar with role playing, completely unfamiliar with the rules of the game, but they sure as
mhm,
hell know what Star Wars is. And
yeah,
I mean, that was my first proper role playing game that I kind of ran, was the FFG Star Wars game. And a big part of that is because I loved Star Wars. I'd rather play in that universe than a generic fantasy universe, and I think that I remember I watched an interview a couple of weeks ago. Recently, the X-wing miniatures game has been finally discontinued after a kind of a long and slow decline. But that's neither here nor there. But the guys who were talking about it were saying, and they were people who run friendly local game stores, right? And they were saying that people would come into the shop who weren't gamers, who would buy the X-wing models because they love Star Wars. And it's
yeah,
like people will reach out and relate to those things because they recognize the IP, and that they are familiar enough with something in it to kind of have a grounding in at least some part of it.
yeah.
And yeah, I think that there is, if we were to do this clinically, I feel like any new role player must first go through a bit of an assessment first, and the assessment this is a slightly interesting viewpoint that I've got. Like, if someone doesn't know that they whether they would enjoy role playing or not, I think there's a bunch of board games that you can play that kind of give you an idea whether you might or not. And I'm thinking there's a couple of board games like Sheriff of Nottingham. Have you ever played Sheriff of Nottingham, Steve?
I think I may have played it once, but it was years ago.
Yeah, so it doesn't have any role playing in it, but the game
Hmm.
is essentially you take it in turns to be the sheriff of Nottingham, you know the guy, and then everyone else is, like a peasant in Nottingham in England in the Middle Ages, and they are trying to smuggle illegal contraband into a market, and the whole game revolves around the sheriff saying, "What have you got in your bag?" And you say, "I've got just apples and cheese,"
Yep.
and whether they believe you or not, and then they demand to search you. That game automatically, naturally falls into role play. And I don't think I've played it with anyone who hasn't got into the spirit of that. So that's kind of a game that has a little element of that. And then I'm thinking of there's other games. There's one called Fun Employed. I don't know if you've heard of that one, but like that's a game where you take it in turns to apply for a job, and the job is on a card that's randomly dealt to you, and you have to apply for it using skills on your CV. The skills are randomly dealt to you. And so you might have to find yourself applying for the job of an astronaut, but your skills that you have to work into the interview are jazz hands, low self esteem, and chronic back pain. Like they are like three,
Yeah.
and you have to do it. And the game, it's so they you are supposed to role play that. The person who sits down on one side of the table says, "Why are you here for this job? Or why do you think you'll be good for the job?" And you have to kind of role play it. And that is, the scenes, quote unquote scenes, are like 2 or 3 minutes long. And I
Hmm.
think if you're playing with someone in your regular board game group or whatever, and they don't ever want to play Fun Employed, and they don't engage in the silliness of Sheriff of Nottingham. I said Sheriff of Nottingham like an American would. Sheriff of Nottingham. Um, if they don't engage with that, then they probably won't find it comfortable doing the role playing stuff, I'd imagine.
Yeah. That's
Um,
really interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it, but it is a little bit like your your screening people, before inviting them to your table. And we do this naturally of
mm,
like, if you're, at least I do, if I'm going to invite people to play a game in my house, I probably want to know them. I probably want to have played a game with them not in my house before
a
before
neutral location,
a neutral
an
location,
underground car park, 2 a.m.
Yep. Yep. I don't know. Maybe they like to like flip over tables
Yeah,
when they
totally.
get
Yeah,
mad.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
um, so it is an interesting idea to have a couple of games kind of at the ready as an easing into role playing to kind of vet people. And I don't know. It's interesting because I feel like there's another side of this too, which is you've got that more practical side of playing these other games that have light role playing elements to them,
Mm-hmm.
kind of see how people interact with that. But how much do you think that APs and streaming games and stuff like that have now influenced and impacted introducing new players? Because one of the players in my group, the first role-playing game he played was a game that I ran, a game
Mm,
of D&D that I ran,
mm-hmm.
because he came and found me at a party and said, I was told that you are the person that I need to talk to if I want to start playing D&D, um, which is flattering.
You're the drug dealer at the party, Steve.
I am,
Go and
yeah.
speak to that guy. He'll hook you up.
This has happened to me more than three
Oh,
times.
I'm sure it
Um,
has.
I've developed a reputation in my town.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of the things that he said to me was, I've been watching Critical Role
Mm,
and I want to play D&D now. And now he is naturally a more theatrical player. I don't think that Critical Role necessarily was the thing that made him that way,
mm,
but I think that because that was his first exposure to how D&D was played, that kind of influenced his expectations of
Mm.
what the game was going to be like. And which is actually a conversation that I had with him before I even agreed to do it. I was like, look, I'm not Matt Mercer. Uh, I don't run the game like Critical Role. Uh, I'm happy to play in a game that has more role play and run a game that has more role play. But like, you got to understand they do their thing because they're professional actors and we are not professional actors.
Hmm.
And so I tried to set those expectations, but his experience and his interaction with the game had been purely through actual plays before sitting down at the table. And I wonder how much of that is impacting new players nowadays. Obviously, your friend Louise probably, didn't have any experience watching any actual plays or anything like that. So came into it completely without any expectations.
Yep.
But then if you have these people who are becoming fans of role playing games because they watched a group of people play them on the internet,
Hmm.
introducing those players is going to be different because they're probably going to bring a certain set of expectations to the table that are maybe not going to line up with your table's ethos and the way that the game is played at your table. So what do you think about the influence that actual plays has on introducing new players?
Um, I think it would be unfair for me to say it was a double-edged sword because I think that the net gain is much greater than the downside. You're getting so many eyes on actual play. You're getting so many eyes on games being played and people learning what these games are and how to play them, even if the style might be different. But like, a conversation with someone who's watched 2 episodes of Critical Role is very different to someone who's watched 1 episode of Stranger Things. If you're talking
Yeah.
to them like what a role playing game's about, they'll have much more of an idea, right?
Yeah.
There is the downside, the Matt Mercer effect, which Matt Mercer has talked about at length, and I had a conversation with the other day on Twitter because a guy I follow on Twitter posted a really painful message saying that like his 14-year-old son had just run a game for his friends at school at like an after school club, and one of them, when they were asked, did you enjoy it, they said that's not how Matt Mercer would have done it. And like I'm I think I remember actually hearing an interview with Matt Mercer about that. Like, he that's not an uncommon thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's less common than people who are like watch Critical Role and want to play a role playing game in good faith. There's also the interesting thing that there's a lot of people who watch Critical Role and have no interest in playing a role playing game,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that
Absolutely.
I watch people play video games, but I have absolutely no interest in picking up a controller because no one wants to see that. No one wants to. No one's going to enjoy that. But in terms of like, I wonder whether if someone said to me who'd never played a role playing game, "Hey, I want to play a game with you guys. I hear you like run games or whatever." That I'm you at the party, right? They come up to me
Yeah.
and they're like, "Hey, are you the guy that can
Yeah.
that can get me into dice and stuff?" I don't think I would ever send them an AP to watch. Like, I don't think I would ever give them that kind of homework. Whereas if someone
Yeah.
like all the time, like I said, I run Blood on the Clock Tower events. It's a big social deduction game. It's not a role playing game at all. But like when people say, "Can I come?" I don't know anything about it. I always send them a video of an actual play of it because it's the best way to learn the game.
Yeah.
I don't think watching an AP of a role playing game is the best way to learn the game, because you're gonna be influenced, you're gonna be biased by what you find attractive about the game, and you're not gonna have played it first. And Louise has very quickly found the parts of the game that she is more comfortable doing. She's very quickly found that she enjoys, the narrative flashbacks part of it sometimes more than she very much enjoys doing role playing scenes with other characters that she knows, the other hunters, rather than non-player characters. She finds that difficult, and that's really, and she's found that very quickly. You would just not get that if you got sent an AP and you watch 6 hours of Critical Role or whatever, which is, I don't know what, half an episode. And that's why I said that it's not a double-edged sword, because I think the positive part of it is much more of a gain than the negative. And I think that those conversations you have with players beforehand about your expectations, theirs and yours, are really important. If they have seen Critical Role and you're like, that is very unusual. And I mean, I have this in a very small way about my channel. Like I've had people leave comments on my videos saying, I love this, I don't want to play Starforged because there's no way I could do this. And I have to just say to them every time, like firstly, you're right, I'm amazing, and you can't know. I don't know. I say firstly, like you really should give it a go.
Yeah.
And also, like, I make this in such an arse backwards way. The only way that this is possible is me doing it for an audience, right? This is you're seeing a product, and that's what Critical Role is. It's a manufactured show, like not like scripted or anything, but like they kind of know what they're doing, and like they are professional actors and improvers, and they are making the show for entertainment purposes, which is why I make my show. And sometimes people lose sight of that a little bit, and that can be a problem with managing expectations. If you had so obviously D&D, we will have to talk about it because it's the most popular game in role playing. It's the most accessible game in the sense that it's available everywhere. I don't think it's the most accessible game. We've talked about this in terms of its actual playability. But like, if someone came to you completely cold, they didn't have any kind of IP in mind, they didn't have a system in mind that they wanted to play, they were like, hey, I just want to try a role playing game. They let's just say they're comfortable playing Fun Employed and Sheriff of Nottingham. They're also like, they understand board games, so they can deal with a bit of crunch. What are you running for them, Steve?
I mean, probably D&D, because I feel like it is, like you said, the most accessible game out there, and so there's a little bit of a like, well, you should probably play this game because if you want to continue playing these games, like this is the game that you're most likely going to find a group to play with. But I don't know, I feel like there are,
so it's interesting you said that, like, you chose D&D because if they were going to go and play with other people, they'd be more likely to find a game. That's interesting, Steve. That's interesting that you said that.
Well, like, I can only play so many games a week.
Yeah. But it's like, what is interesting is that, like, your thought was instantly like, how could they get into the hobby and find it more sustainable, rather than would you like to try something different or interesting or even simple, like I'm off the top of my head thinking of simple games. And the thing is, you're dead right, is that, like, I find this all the time with miniatures games. People are like, well, I could get into this indie miniatures game, but there's no scene in my town. I can't get a game. I can't take my miniatures down to FLGS and get a game, like pick up a scratch game. But you take Warhammer 40k or Age of Sigmar, there'll be people playing that. You take your D20s and your player's handbook down to any comic book shop or game store, you can get a game, or you'll at least find out when there is one. And it's interesting because my thought was like, I always feel like D&D should be a game that you work up to rather than a game you work back from. And I've said this before, that, like, there is a level of complexity to the rules in some of it that I feel like when people learn, they are resistant to learn other systems because they've spent all their time learning D&D, which is, it's not an
Yeah.
uncommon theory, and I think that it rings true in a lot of cases. But my first thought instantly was, I wonder how someone who wanted to get into role-playing games would take to one of those, like one-page rules games, because they are really accessible, they're really easy, they're really rules light, and they're fun. But are they giving you a real idea of what a role-playing game is? So, for instance, if like me, you, and like some of our friends and one person who's never played a role-playing game said, let's play a game online, you run it for me, and I said, okay, we'll run Honey Heist. Right? Anyone who doesn't know what Honey Heist is, it's a game where you play bears stealing honey. You have two stats, criminal and bear. It's really fun. It's really goofy. And, I personally think it's a great introduction to role-playing games. But then if you went from that to like, hey, do you want to play Call of Cthulhu? Or you want to play Pathfinder, that's a leap, isn't it?
It is. It is. It really is. And I think you're right. There's almost two hobbies, or two sides of the hobby where it's like, well, these are the one page, one shot games that are fun and easy to play and enjoyable. We get a lot of laughs out of them. And then you've got your 10-year campaign games on the other side. And it's kind of hard to prepare people for we're going to play a long campaign. And I think there's an argument to be made that we shouldn't be playing long campaigns, that we should be playing, shorter rounds of things. Not to keep talking about the between, but you're playing what, 14 sessions is the
it's like 12 to 15 sessions and you're done.
12 to 15 basically. Sessions.
Yeah. And like, you're not done as in like you decide you've had enough, you run out of material. That's just it.
Yeah. And I just played our 28th session of D&D in this campaign, and we're closing in on the end of Act 1. So
yeah, but I mean, and the thing is, those games support that, but then they are much more open. And when we finished last week's session, and we're three sessions from the end of the between, and Louise actually said, like, I can't believe we're coming to the end, and the rest of the players around the table, and myself included, who are all,
I can't believe we're coming to the end.
Yeah, exactly that. We were all, like, I'd say seasoned players, or like we've played games for years or whatever, and we were like, you are going to be a rarity in the fact that you could sit in a room full of people who play role-playing games and say, I finished a campaign. Because it's not that common. Like, we talked about it in our ending role-playing game campaign, like role-playing game campaigns episode. But like, she'll have 100% success rate of campaigns started and finished. But to the point of like the kind of one-page rule kind of lighter games, I do think they can be slightly misleading, but I do think that, like, so for instance, something like Honey Heist is great. Crash Pandas, I don't know if you've heard, it's by the same author. It's basically there's 6 of you and you're all a raccoon and you've got to drive a car, and one of you can only do one thing each. But like, all of those games are kind of they're kind of really fun. There's Everyone is John. Have you heard of that one? That's like,
I haven't played it, but I've definitely heard of it.
So those kind of games are good, but they're kind of, they're gimmicky a little, aren't they? And they aren't reflective of even indie games, where even if it's like a PBTA game, you have a character sheet, you have some stats that, the rules aren't as crunchy as other games, but like Honey Heist, those other games, a little further away. But I suppose you could kind of go through the gears, couldn't you? Because after Honey Heist and Crash Pandas and things like that, you've got things like Lasers and Feelings, which is very rules light. You've got stuff like Fiasco, which is pretty much all role playing and kind of quite wild role playing. It's probably the first role playing game I can think of that I've played where I've sat around and thought, oh, actually, we're probably going to have a conversation before we start this about the content of this game, because
Yeah.
this could go in all manner. I mean, all games should have that conversation, but that was the
Mhm.
first game that I played where I was like, oh yeah, I can see where this might not be appropriate for all audiences,
Yeah.
and yeah, you kind of got you could take them through the games, but who's got that kind of time, Steve,
Yeah.
to kind of run people
That's
through
that
that?
that literally just made me think of like now I want to get a group of people who have never played any role-playing games before and do like a sampler
Mm,
where it's like, okay, we're going to play the one-page RPG, we're going to do the fiasco, we're going to do a PBTA game, we're going to do D20 fantasy game, and like go through, here are the different like levels of crunch,
hmm
what is appealing, and then from there you can be like, all right, let's play this. If we can all come to some consensus about like this is our favorite style of play, then we're compatible as a table and we should continue on, which
Congratulations,
sounds, yeah,
you've completed your 36-week induction into role playing games, and it turns out you don't like them. So
yeah,
yeah,
that'll be $1,500. uh
we've got a great business plan here, Steve.
I love it. But it is interesting to think about doing, a honey heist or something like that. Talking about playing board games that have some of those role playing elements. That's almost like the next step up,
hmm
and then you can go on from there. But I think you can also take games like D&D, and this would be one of my other pieces of advice. Like if you want to run a crunchier game, just don't use all the parts of the system. You
hmm
don't have to introduce a new player to everything in D&D. Or I've been playing a lot of Traveler,
hmm
and there are a lot of moving parts and pieces in Traveler, and you can get really into the nitty-gritty. But at the end of the day, you can just say, all right, roll your 2d6, add your stat and this skill, and you want to hit a 10.
hmm
And that is it. If you're playing D&D, you can say, roll a d20 and add your, wisdom modifier. If you don't even want to do that, if you want people to have a really simple introduction to the game, you can just reduce all of your DCs by 3 to 5 to just account for skills.
hmm
So be like, oh, you're trained in athletics. Okay. Yeah. Try climbing that wall, roll your D20. If you get a 9 on the die, you succeed at getting up that wall. So I think there are ways to introduce games that have more crunch to them
hmm
with two new players without having to be like, all right, shakunk, here's the rule book. You need to learn all of these rules before you can start playing.
Yeah,
And I think this is important for introducing new players, but I think it's also important for introducing new game masters as
yeah,
well,
yeah,
because
definitely.
the most consistent thing that I hear from people when I say, oh, you're gonna run a game for us eventually, is like, oh, I don't know that I could do that. There's just way too much to keep track of. And it's like, first of all, yeah, it's it's not easy, but also it doesn't have to be as hard as you think it is.
Mm,
And you don't necessarily have to remember all of the rules all of the time.
yeah.
So I think there are ways to introduce new players by piecemealing some of the rules and saying like, these are the basic things that we need to know. And honestly, like this is no new uh idea. I mean, quick starts are a thing that games have been doing for years, and I think they're fantastic. I love using quick starts to introduce a new game to people,
hmm
because it's a really fun way for me, as somebody who likes learning new role-playing games but doesn't have infinite time to read a 200-page rule book. But if I can read a you know 10-page adventure and rules document, and there are pre-generated characters that I can hand out to people, and I can read it on the day.
Hmm.
We can sit down and play the game that night, and maybe I'm introducing new players, maybe I'm just introducing my group to a new game. Like, I think that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
I would like to change my answer though. uh it would be Blades in the Dark. If I
Blaze
was
in the Dark,
introducing
yeah.
somebody, yeah, they weren't specifically like, I want to learn to play D&D,
Mm.
because that's usually what happens. Is usually when somebody comes up and asks to learn role-playing games, they already know about D&D, and D.
Hmm.
And so maybe part of it is that's the only thing that they know to ask for. But I think there's also a little bit of, they're asking because it's part of the cultural zeitgeist.
Yeah, and like
And
we've said this before, like a lot of times D&D is synonymous. What people say, they mean role playing game when they say D&D. They just don't know another name
yeah,
of it. So yeah, I have actually had a conversation with people, and they're like, "Oh, I hear you play D&D," and I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry, you've been misinformed. I don't play D&D," and they're like, "Oh no, I know you
yeah,
play a different game, but like that's what I know it as, you know."
yeah,
So yeah, sometimes that's just the shorthand, isn't it? I guess.
yeah. But I would probably do Blades in the Dark or Scum and Villainy, for some
Mm.
sci-fi blades,
It's
because
interesting you said about quick starts, because I hadn't really. I just thought when you were saying that, I was like, I've never run a quick start, and then I actually thought when I played and started the first campaign I ever GM'd for, which is the Star Wars Edge of the Empire one.
Mhm.
Everyone had ideas of what they wanted their characters to be, so they came up with them and rolled them up and that kind of stuff. But the actual adventure, the first adventure I ran, was basically the quick start, and I just took a bit from. There was a bit I didn't like, so I just took that out and replaced it with a bit from another pre-written adventure, and then just wrote a little bit that linked them all together.
Mhm.
And yeah, essentially, I ran the quick start adventure, which was, they're designed purposefully to kind of onboard people into the idea of the game and everything. Then you're right, they are great. Um, there was an interesting point I thought about where sometimes you might not have a player who's interested in role playing, but they are definitely interested in creativity and storytelling. And do you think that some of those games that are technically role playing games but aren't really are interesting for them? So, for instance, something like The Quiet Year, which is a game that requires a great deal of creativity and storytelling,
Mhm.
and no role play whatsoever, or something like Microscope, which is very similar, these world building games,
Mhm.
or things like Tangled Blessings, which we've played together, which is based on interpreting creative prompts, but there's no role play in that. Like, we did some role play in a couple of little bits, but like there's no actual need to role play any of that, right?
Yeah.
Are games like that perhaps a different way to kind of gauge whether someone might be interested in role playing games?
Yeah, I think so. I absolutely think so. And I think I still think that that's a gateway
Mm,
into something, because it's a role playing game, and we don't want to forget the game part of it,
yep.
because then it just becomes improv.
Hmm.
And like, there's nothing wrong with that, but you know I like to roll dice and interface with a system, because that tickles a part of my brain. But there is also just the role playing part of that moniker does require embodying a character.
Hmm.
uh so I think maybe then my question to somebody who's like, I don't really want to role play, but I want to, be creative and engage with this. I feel like my question back to them would be like, okay, what do you mean by role playing? Is
Mm,
it that you've watched Critical Role and you don't want to have a, deep emotional scene with another player? Because that's okay. To me, if you're role playing and you are pretending to be, Thordar the dwarf paladin, and you don't talk in character at all, but you say, Thordar goes and is going to stop those goblins from robbing that cart because, Thordar's god doesn't believe in thievery.
hmm.
That's role playing. I
Yep.
mean, that's
100%.
You're congratulations, you're doing the thing.
Mm.
So I guess it just kind of depends on if they're like, I don't want to tell a story um, about a single. Maybe that's unfair because Quiet Year definitely tells a story.
Hmm.
But like, I don't want to tell a story about a single character. I don't want to embody a single character.
Yeah.
I want to tell a story about a world. You know, that's totally fine. In that case, I would say role playing games just probably aren't for you.
Hmm.
Um, there's nothing wrong with just enjoying games like The Quiet Year or Microscope. I love those games,
Hmm.
but I think that when we're talking about role playing games, there is a specificity that is about embodying a specific character and interacting with a world and also interacting with consequences
Hmm.
because you know, and that's something that I like to try to introduce to new players is like, don't be afraid to take action. Like, we live in a world where, you know, you can make the wrong choice and something bad can happen to you, and we understandably are relatively risk averse as humans,
Hmm.
but we're creating characters in a fantasy world or a science fictional world who they may experience consequences, but the only consequence to us as the players is that, you know, hopefully something interesting happens, or at worst we have to create a new character and engage in a different way in that world. And so it's a little bit of like, don't be afraid of role playing your character to the hilt and going after those consequences. And so I think that's where introducing somebody, and if they don't have that interest in embodying a character and role playing, that's totally fine. These types of games just might not be for you.
Counterpoint, Steve. Just thought about this.
Ooh.
Before we started recording, I was like, are solo games appropriate for people who've never played a role playing game before? Well, let's just say that you're not comfortable role playing, and let's just say that you're not particularly interested in in that part of it, but
Mhm.
you are interested in exploring creative opportunities, but you want to play a solo game and it's a journaling game. So something like Thousand Year Old Vampire, Apothecaria, or something like that, where, you know, it's creative. You are creating a character. You are engaging with other characters in a world. Um, that's totally valid, right? I think that's whilst we've said that before, and some people do struggle with the concept of solo role playing games, something like a journaling game, which is very clear, it's essentially a creative writing exercise
Mhm.
with characters and elements of randomness thrown in. You know, is that a good way to introduce people to role playing games?
I think it can be,
Mm-hmm.
but also I think similar to talking about Honey Heist and one page RPGs, it is playing solo is a very different experience than playing with a group of people around the table.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I love about playing solo is that I can really focus in on a character and their conflicts, and I can make the story go in whatever direction I want it to. When you're playing with a group, you really shouldn't do that. Like, you're creating the story together at the table as a group, and so you're not necessarily in control of your fate in the same way that I think you are with solo games.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a journaling RPG is definitely a game, a way to introduce somebody to the hobby as a way in to sort of learning about, you know, how to embody a character, how to think about being someone other than yourself. But I think it would have to come with the caveat of, when you come to a table full of other players, you can't think of yourself as the hero of the story. Like, you're
Mm,
part of an ensemble, you're not the main character.
yeah. Um, while we briefly just touched on it there, do you think a really good way to introduce a new player to role playing games is a GMless game,
Mhm.
like a co op game? Because
Yeah.
you, as someone who perhaps has played a role playing game before, plays as an equal participant, but you're also kind of semi guiding them. I've been asked this question quite a lot. Like, would I ever run Ironsworn for people? Would I ever run Starforge for people? And my answer
Yeah.
is always no. I'll play co-op with you because,
Yeah.
like, if I'm going to be running it, like, it's not designed really to be run as, you know, you can run it, but you're
Mhm.
basically just rolling on tables and describing stuff. And
Yeah.
I may as well be a player alongside you and be doing that. And,
Yeah.
you know, between us, we can work out what these things mean. Don't rely on me. It's part of the fun of it. So I think that GMless games actually are really interesting ways to learn how to role play because it gives you a bit of both perspectives. Because, you know, it would take a very brave person, and it always invariably ends up being one person. Let's say there's four people who know how to play a role playing game. One of them's gonna have to run, right? If they're playing
Yeah.
D&D, one of them's gonna have to learn the rules and run the game. If you play a GMless game, you're kind of all steering the boat, right? You're all
Mhm.
kind of equally as responsible for what's going on.
Yeah.
But there is also that potential of like a more experienced player might kind of handhold a bit too much, or yeah, but there might be a little bit of that at the start. But I think ultimately it's a good way to get people into the idea of being creative on the fly and making their own decisions.
Yeah. I really like that. I think that is a good way to introduce people to the idea of running games
Hmm.
because to your point, somebody's got to run the game if you're doing a guided game. And oftentimes what happens is you get the one person that runs it and then everybody else is like, well, that just seems too hard. I don't want to do that. And so if you're playing a GMless game and you're all participating in running the game, it demystifies it a little bit.
Hmm.
And I think empowers people to be like, oh, actually, it's fun when I get to say what happens. And I think some of the newer indie games, starting with like Powered by the Apocalypse and games like that, where you get the idea of like, okay, well, when you roll a complete success, you tell me what happens. When it's a mixed success, we kind of compromise on what happens. And if it's a failure, like I tell you what bad thing happens to you,
Yeah.
because that's a really soft way of giving people narrative control over the story and not just their characters.
Yeah.
Whereas in maybe traditional D20 fantasy games and more like traditional games, you have control over your character and that's it. And so trying to think about controlling the world or, the narrative, it's intimidating. And so GMless games are a good way, I think, to introduce new players to the concept that we are creating a story and engaging in a story together at the table,
Hmm.
and that you don't have to be afraid of taking some of that control and engaging with it.
Mm. No, that's very good advice. I think we should probably wrap this up now. I think we've probably talked quite a lot about how to indoctrinate new new people into this hobby.
Yeah.
I will leave everyone with a couple of recommendations that I haven't mentioned that I should have probably shoehorned in elsewhere. One is the game Quest, which I've talked
Hmm.
about before. It's kind of in a mysterious kind of limbo type thing because they don't know if the people who make it are still supporting it or printing it. You can download the quick start for free. It has a quick start. It's very rules light. I've made a whole video on this. It's so accessible. I can't believe it's not more popular. It really is a game where you are introducing everyone to the concept of role playing, concepts of GMing, concepts of being a player at the table. It's got stats, it's got spells, it's got levels, it's got dice, it's got everything, but it is just a much easier way to play than learning, like Steve says, some more traditional D20 based fantasy games. And also, I'd recommend the game Mission Accomplished, which I played, is incredibly silly. If you want to try it and see if someone will lean into perhaps more outrageous aspects of role playing without playing something like Fiasco, which has a bit more to it. Mission Accomplished is the game where you are spies trying to explain to HR what went wrong on a mission, whilst trying to pin the blame on everyone else around the table. It's really fun. I've run it a couple of times, and something like that is a really good way to, even if you are got players who have played a lot of games before, it's a really good like kind of blow off steam game at the end of a campaign or in the break of a campaign. Have you got any final recommendations for people or final bits of advice to leave our lovely listeners with?
I mean, I think the most important thing, and we kind of touched on it earlier, um, but it is important to talk to a new player, not only about what their interests are, what the favorite like characters from media, and like who they might want to be, and talking about consequences in role playing games, and that it's not um, it's not a bad thing if your character fails and runs into trouble. Like that's part of where the fun is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but just the idea that like consent is so incredibly important, and this is something that we should all be practicing at our tables, whether we're experienced or new players.
Mm-hmm.
But especially when introducing a new player, making sure that there's this understanding of like, we are playing a game, and yeah, we're creating these characters, we're trying to embody these characters, and pretending to deal with all sorts of different circumstances, but it is entirely okay and acceptable to tap out if something makes you uncomfortable, or to also to like make it explicit. And this is something that I like to do with new players,
Mm-hmm.
is making it explicit that, hey, I'm running the game and I'm introducing these consequences, but I'm rooting for you. I'm on your side.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's something that is making you uncomfortable, or is a circumstance or a situation comes up that you're just like, man, that sucks. Like I'm not having fun anymore. Like we're just playing a game to have fun.
Yeah.
And like we joked earlier about, you can't really win at role playing games, and it's true. Um, I think the best way to win is that everybody has fun and that it is a positive experience. And like Matt was talking about, the between before we started recording, like it's a very kind of grueling experience, but it's not a bad experience. It's not a negative experience for the players.
No.
And for somebody who is a new player to role playing games, and like you mentioned earlier, like she's going to have a hard time going and playing a different campaign,
Mm-hmm.
or a different game, and being like, this is totally different.
I'm really looking forward
It's
to her. I'm really looking forward to her playing a game and being like, "Oh, hang on, I'm a good guy.
yeah,
Like, I'm not an awful person who just spends
yeah,
every session every week stealing body parts from like
yeah,
cadavers to build a zombie." Yeah,
yeah.
it's wild how people can have their expectations radically altered by their first experience.
Mhm.
But what you were saying is 100% true. No game is more important than the players playing it. So, player safety and, positive play culture is so important to reinforce with new players. And I think that's
Yeah.
ultimately the most important thing. So,
Because we want more people to
we
come
do.
into the hobby, and we want them to continue playing and not walk away and be like, wow, that was a terrible experience. I don't
Hmm.
ever want to do that again.
Yeah.
Because I think we all have had those experiences where we're just like, I why am I doing this? Because that was an awful experience.
Yep.
And we don't want that.
We do not. We do not. And we hope that if you find yourself in the rare situation that someone comes up to you at a party and says, I hear you're the guy, I hear you're the person that can get me into games, that now you will be armed with perhaps a few options if you want to lead them down the road of hardcore crunch, or whether you want to go kind of bright and breezy and have criminal bears running amok. But yeah, that's our episode, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll be back next month, and I think we're going to play a game next month, aren't we?
I think so.
Yeah, all things
That's
going
the
well.
hope.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Everyone, thank you. Say goodbye, Steve. Goodbye, Steve.
Bye.